In the remote foothills of eastern Wyoming in 2011, veteran hunter Carl Weston was tracking a rogue grizzly that had been terrorizing local cattle ranches for months. The Bighorn Mountain region had always been known for its wildlife, but this particular bear had become infamous across 3 counties. Historically, the area had seen its share of predator livestock conflicts since settlers first arrived in the 1800s, but nothing compared to the destruction this single animal had caused. The bear had destroyed livestock worth thousands of dollars across multiple properties, leaving mangled carcasses and broken fences in its wake. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the beast, a scarred, massive grizzly rumored to weigh over 1,200 pounds, with a distinctive white patch on its chest and a notched left ear. Some claimed it was unnaturally aggressive, perhaps due to an old hunting injury that had left it unable to hunt natural prey efficiently. Whatever the reason, Carlton had been hired to end the threat once and for all. A former wildlife officer with 27 years of hunting experience, Weston took the assignment seriously. For weeks, he studied the bear's patterns, following broken branches, paw prints nearly 14 inches across, and scattered remains of its kills. The ranchers needed someone with his expertise, as the bear had become increasingly bold, approaching ranch buildings and showing no fear of humans, a dangerous development that couldn't be ignored. On October 15th, after tracking the animal for 17 days, Weston rose before dawn and positioned himself downwind from what he believed was the bear's primary travel route between feeding grounds. The morning air carried a biting chill as he settled into position near a dense thicket bordering Harlow Creek. Armed with his trusted 45-70 lever-action rifle, he waited patiently as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the pines. The attack came without warning. Rather than approaching along the trail as expected, the massive grizzly had somehow circled behind him. Weston heard only a brief rustle before the bear exploded from the thick brush merely 30 yards away, charging at full speed. The hunter barely had time to shoulder his rifle before the animal closed half the distance between them. His first shot struck the bear's shoulder, a solid hit that would have dropped most animals instantly. The grizzly faltered momentarily, but continued its charge with renewed fury. Weston's second round punched into the bear's chest, yet incredibly, it kept coming. Time seemed to slow as the hunter worked the lever of his rifle with practiced precision, firing again and again as the distance between them vanished. The third and fourth shots hit the bear's upper body, drawing blood but failing to stop its momentum. At 20 feet, Weston could see the rage in the animal's eyes and smell its musty fur. His fifth shot struck the bear's neck, causing it to stumble slightly but not fall. The sixth round hit just below the jaw as the bear rose to its full height, towering nearly 9 feet tall on its hind legs. With the grizzly barely 10 feet away, Weston fired his seventh and final round directly into the bear's chest cavity. The massive animal crashed forward, sliding to a stop just short of the hunter's boots. The entire encounter had lasted less than 15 seconds. Drenched in sweat and spattered with blood, Weston sat down heavily on a nearby log, his hands shaking with adrenaline as he realized how close he had come to being torn apart. It took 30 minutes before he could steady himself enough to use his satellite phone to call the nearest ranch for assistance. When ranch hands Tobias Blackwood and Javier Montez arrived 2 hours later with a truck and winch, they were awestruck by the bear's size. Even experienced outdoorsmen, they admitted they had never seen anything like it. The animal required all 3 men and specialized equipment to load onto the vehicle. Later examination confirmed the bear weighed 1,153 pounds, making it one of the largest grizzlies ever documented in Wyoming. Its necropsy revealed old bullet fragments lodged in its hip and shoulder, likely explaining its inability to hunt natural prey and its resulting aggression toward livestock. Wildlife authorities estimated the bear was approximately 18 years old, with teeth worn from age and battle. Weston's encounter quickly became legendary across the region. Local newspaper editor Priscilla Hargrove wrote a front-page story titled 7 Rounds, the Monster of Bighorn County, which was picked up by outdoor publications. Ranch owner Frederick Hollister presented Weston with a custom knife made from the bear's claw as a token of appreciation for ending the threat to local livelihoods. In the years that followed, Carlton occasionally gave talks at hunting safety courses about the importance of proper caliber selection and shot placement. He emphasized that his survival had been as much about preparation and training as it was about luck. The mounted bear eventually found a home in the county museum, where it continued to draw visitors curious about the legendary animal that required 7 rounds to bring down. Weston himself never hunted bear again, claiming that after looking into the eyes of such a magnificent creature at point-blank range, something in him had changed. He continued to hunt deer and elk, but focused more on conservation work in his later years. The experience had given him a profound respect for the wilderness that still existed in even the most settled parts of Wyoming, and a first-hand understanding of humanity's tenuous position in the natural. An experienced hiker and camper, Emily found solace in the solitude of nature, far from the noise and distractions of modern life. For her latest adventure, she had chosen the remote wilderness of Kodiak Island, an area known for its rugged terrain and abundant wildlife. Towering mountains, dense forests, and the endless expanse of water surrounding the island made it the perfect escape. She hoped to reconnect with the land and find peace away from the demands of everyday life. Upon arriving at her campsite near the banks of a quiet river, Emily felt a wave of calm wash over her. After setting up her tent, she gathered firewood, her mind at ease as the rhythmic crackling of the flames began to fill the air. She had no particular agenda, just a few days to herself to hike along the river, explore the island, and sleep beneath the stars. As night settled in, she sat by the fire, the warmth comforting her against the cool evening breeze. She cooked a simple meal and took in the stillness that surrounded her. There were no voices, no traffic, no reminders of the modern world, only the vast silence of the wild. Thoughts of family and friends back home surfaced briefly, but quickly drifted away as she turned her gaze upward, losing herself in the stars. Unbeknownst to her, she was not alone. A Kodiak bear, one of the largest and most powerful bears in the world, had been prowling the area, drawn by the scent of food. The spring had been harsher than usual, and hunger gnawed at the animal, driving it to take risks it might otherwise avoid. Emily heard nothing at first. She remained immersed in the fire's glow, unaware that something monstrous was moving closer. It wasn't until the crunch of leaves reached her ears that her body tensed. The sound grew louder, closer. A sharp chill crept up her spine as she instinctively stopped moving, her senses suddenly alert. The quiet now felt heavy, unnatural. Then she saw it. Just beyond the firelight, the bear emerged from the shadows, huge, silent, and terrifying. Its dark fur seemed to blend with the night, but its eyes caught the firelight, flickering with hunger. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had no weapons, nothing but the bear spray clipped to her belt. Training and preparation had always seemed enough. Until now. The bear snorted and stepped forward. Panic flooded her system, but instinct took over. She couldn't outrun it, and there was nowhere to hide. The bear's head looked nearly as wide as her chest. Its massive claws flexed in anticipation. Emily's hand went to the spray. Her fingers, trembling, fumbled with the safety cap. The bear advanced again and lunged. Its massive paw swung through the air, crashing into her campsite and sending the tent flying. Emily barely had time to react before she felt the claws tear across her side. Pain erupted across her ribs, sharp and blinding. Her scream was lost to the wilderness as she crumpled to the ground, blood seeping through her clothes. Adrenaline surged. She staggered back to her feet, heart pounding, limbs shaking. The bear circled, growling, its breath harsh, its eyes locked on her. It had her cornered. She was hurt, alone, and disoriented. Every instinct urged her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Survival meant standing her ground. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment something passed between them. The bear hesitated, as if weighing its options. Emily's hand clenched tighter around the canister. With a breath that trembled through her whole body, she raised it and took aim. Her thumb pressed down on the trigger. The spray shot out in a powerful stream, striking the bear squarely in the eyes. It recoiled with a guttural growl, stumbling backward. The acrid scent of the chemical filled the air, overpowering the smoke from the campfire. The bear pawed frantically at its face, snarling in frustration. Its aggression suddenly checked. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears as the creature shook its head, clearly disoriented and in pain. She didn't hesitate. Fueled by adrenaline, she staggered toward the edge of the campsite, her legs trembling beneath her. The pain in her side flared with every step, but she forced herself forward. Behind her, the bear growled again, quieter now, more uncertain. It hadn't fully retreated, but it had pulled back. Emily kept moving, each breath shallow and ragged. Her grip tightened around the bear spray as she reached a dense thicket nearby, its tangled branches offering scant protection. She crouched low, wincing with every movement, her body drained and bleeding. But the bear didn't follow, for now it had vanished into the forest. Time passed in a blur of pain and vigilance. The shock of the attack began to wear off, replaced by the cold weight of reality. Her side throbbed with each breath, and the blood soaking through her clothes had begun to dry. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed help, and soon. The bear had nearly killed her, but she had survived. Barely. She spent the night huddled in the undergrowth, too afraid to sleep, her senses straining for any sound of the predator's return. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind sent her heart racing. The wilderness that had once brought her peace now seemed full of unseen threats. By morning, Emily was barely conscious. Dizzy from blood loss and cold, she forced herself to rise. One agonizing step at a time, she began the long journey toward the trail she had followed days earlier. She didn't know how far she would make it, but she refused to give up. The rescue team found her the following day, stumbling through the underbrush toward the edge of the trail. Her wounds were deep and her body weakened, but she was alive. Against the odds, she had endured the night. Survival had come down to quick thinking and an unyielding will to live. The attack would remain with her forever, a brutal reminder that the wilderness, for all its beauty, could be merciless. Emily had faced the beast of Kodiak Island and lived to tell the tale, but the scars it left behind, both visible and unseen, would never fully fade. In the picturesque outskirts of Banff, Alberta, Canada, in 2006, the Thornbridge family returned from their week-long summer vacation to find their mountain retreat in shocking disarray. The property, nestled among towering pines a few miles from the edge of protected wilderness, had been in Maxwell Thornbridge's family for generations. The area had long served as a critical wildlife corridor, with human settlements gradually encroaching on natural habitats over the decades. The Thornbridges, Maxwell, his wife Elaine, and their teenage children Harper and Reed, had spent 7 days visiting relatives in Vancouver, leaving their home securely locked. Upon arrival, they immediately noticed something was terribly wrong. The kitchen window had been shattered, glass fragments scattered across the countertop and floor. Inside, the destruction was extensive. Furniture overturned, upholstery shredded, and food containers torn apart and emptied. Maxwell initially suspected vandals or burglars, but as they cautiously moved through the first floor, distinct animal droppings and claw marks on the wooden door frames suggested a different culprit. The family proceeded carefully, documenting the damage for insurance purposes while keeping their voices low. The children stayed close to their mother as Maxwell investigated further. The strange, musky odor grew stronger near the basement door. Maxwell approached it carefully, noticing deep scratches in the wood. Placing his ear against the door, he froze. Unmistakable sounds of movement came from below. Something large was moving around in their basement. Maxwell whispered for his family to return to their vehicle immediately while he called the local wildlife authorities. Elaine ushered the children outside, but 16-year-old Reed insisted on staying with his father. Against better judgment, Maxwell allowed him to remain in the living room while he contacted emergency services. The dispatcher advised them to evacuate completely and wait for rangers to arrive, warning that a cornered wild animal could be extremely dangerous. As Maxwell ended the call, a tremendous crash echoed from behind the basement door, followed by the splintering of wood. Concerned the animal might break through before help arrived, Maxwell decided to check if the door was properly secured. This critical error in judgment nearly cost him his life. When Maxwell turned the handle to test the lock, the door burst open with explosive force. A medium-sized black bear, approximately 300 pounds and frenzied from captivity, charged through the opening. Disoriented and terrified after days trapped in the dark basement, the bear perceived Maxwell as a threat. Before he could react, the animal slammed into him, sending him tumbling backward down the basement stairs. Reed shouted from the living room, drawing the bear's attention momentarily. This gave Maxwell precious seconds to scramble behind an overturned workbench. The bear, confused by the multiple human scents and overwhelmed by its sudden freedom, paced aggressively at the bottom of the stairs, occasionally charging at Maxwell's makeshift barrier. From his defensive position, Maxwell grabbed a broomstick to keep the animal at bay while shouting instructions to his son. Reed, displaying remarkable composure, called emergency services again, emphasizing the dire situation while retreating to the relative safety of the kitchen. For nearly 20 harrowing minutes, Maxwell defended himself with the broomstick, receiving several glancing blows from the bear's powerful paws. Each time the animal charged, Maxwell jabbed at its sensitive nose, temporarily driving it back, but enraging it further. During one particularly aggressive assault, the bear's claws tore through Maxwell's jacket and into his side, leaving deep lacerations. Park rangers, Helena Yoshida and Bernard Clements, arrived with remarkable speed, entering through the front door with tranquilizer equipment. The bear, hearing new threats from above, renewed its aggression against Maxwell. Ranger Yoshida fired a tranquilizer dart, striking the bear's hindquarters. The animal roared and spun around, charging up the stairs toward the rangers. Ranger Clements deployed bear spray, creating a defensive chemical barrier while Yoshida reloaded. The bear hesitated, affected by the irritating spray, giving Yoshida the opportunity to fire a second dart. Within minutes, the tranquilizer took effect, and the bear collapsed in the narrow hallway between the basement and kitchen. Medical technicians arrived shortly afterward, finding Maxwell severely injured with 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and deep claw wounds across his torso and arms. The emergency team stabilized him before transport to a local hospital, where he would spend 11 days recovering. Wildlife authorities later determined the black bear, a 5-year-old male, had likely been attracted to the property by improperly stored garbage before the family's departure. After breaking through the kitchen window, it had eventually found its way to the basement, where the door had swung shut behind it. Trapped for approximately 6 days without adequate food or water, the animal had become increasingly desperate and destructive. The bear was relocated deep into backcountry territory, over 70 miles from human settlements, after veterinary examination. Conservation Officer Priya Mehta explained that the bear's behavior was not predatory, but rather panic-driven, a desperate animal seeking escape rather than confrontation. The Thornbridge home required extensive repairs, totaling nearly $42,000. Insurance covered most of the damage, but the psychological impact proved far more lasting. Elaine insisted on installing advanced security systems and metal shutters on all ground floor windows. The children experienced nightmares for months following the incident, with Reed requiring counseling to process the trauma of nearly witnessing his father's death. Maxwell recovered physically, but developed a heightened awareness of wildlife proximity that bordered on paranoia. The basement was completely renovated, with the wooden door replaced by a reinforced metal security door. Despite these precautions, the family never quite felt safe in their home again. Every unexplained sound in the night brought renewed anxiety. The incident prompted local authorities to launch an educational campaign about proper food storage and waste management in wildlife-adjacent communities. The Thornbridge case was frequently cited in these materials as a sobering reminder that wilderness didn't always stay outside the front door. Their experience demonstrated how quickly an ordinary situation could transform into a life-threatening encounter when human settlements intersected with wild animal territories. The rugged backcountry of Wyoming was David's sanctuary. A seasoned hunter, he had spent years learning the land, tracking elk, and mastering the art of survival in the wild. This part of the wilderness, with its towering peaks and thick forests, was familiar ground, a place where David felt at peace. It was early spring, and the ground was still hard from winter's grip, but David knew the elk would be moving soon, drawn to the fresh growth sprouting from the thawing earth. David was alone today. His rifle slung over his shoulder, he made his way through the dense woods, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape for signs of movement. His gear was light. He preferred to travel without encumbrance, and his sharp eyes were trained on every sound, every shift in the forest. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. But today, something felt off. The wind was unusually still, and the air had a weight to it, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. David paused at the edge of a clearing, the dirt beneath his boots soft and moist. The sunlight filtering through the trees was just enough to illuminate the forest floor, but the shadows were still long, stretching in odd angles across the land. As he knelt to inspect the tracks of an elk, something else caught his attention. A deep, unmistakable imprint, the kind only a grizzly bear could leave. His heart skipped a beat. A bear, and not just any bear, a grizzly with its massive paws and razor-sharp claws. The tracks were fresh, the edges of the print still crisp in the mud. David's pulse quickened. He'd encountered bears in the wild before. He'd even had close calls, but never this close to his hunting grounds. The thought of a grizzly so near unsettled him, but he knew better than to panic. Bears were territorial, but they usually avoided humans unless they felt threatened or cornered. He just needed to be careful, he reminded himself. Stay calm. He continued his trek, moving slowly now, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. His mind raced through the checklist of safety measures he'd learned over the years. Make noise, stay visible, keep your distance. He wasn't in any immediate danger, at least that's what he kept telling himself. The forest was vast, and a grizzly would more likely be focused on food than on him. But the deeper David went into the woods, the more he felt like something was watching him. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig underfoot made him jump. He wasn't a man prone to fear, but this was different. There was something heavy in the air, something wrong. The bear was close. David heard it first. The low growl vibrated through the air, a deep, primal sound that shook the very trees. The sound was impossible to miss, coming from somewhere in the dense thicket just ahead. David froze, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. The grizzly was nearby, and it was already aware of him. He scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of the massive creature. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind was sharp. The bear was still out of sight, but it was too close for comfort. He didn't know if it was hungry or just curious, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. Slowly, he began to backtrack, hoping to put distance between himself and the predator. But then, out of the corner of his eye, something moved. Too fast, too suddenly. David whipped his head toward the sound and his blood ran cold. The grizzly charged. It was a blur of muscle and fury, its massive body hurtling through the trees toward him with terrifying speed. David didn't have time to think. He reached for his bear spray, but it was too late. The bear was already upon him, its claws raking across the air. He raised his rifle, but the grizzly knocked it from his hands before he could even aim. David barely managed to sidestep as the bear lunged again, its massive paws slamming into his side. He felt the weight of the bear's claws tear into his flesh, and pain exploded through his ribs. He stumbled, losing his footing, and the bear pressed its advantage, coming down on him with terrifying force. His mind was a blur of panic and instinct. He tried to bring his rifle to bear, but the bear was too close, too fast. Its teeth sank into his arm, ripping through his jacket and muscle. David screamed, but the sound was lost in the growl of the bear. He reached for his bear spray, but his hand couldn't find it in the chaos. The grizzly was relentless, its jaws snapping, its claws digging into his back as it pinned him to the ground. David fought back, his muscles burning with effort. He swung his fists at the bear, but they were like punches against a wall of steel. His vision blurred with blood, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The bear's weight was suffocating, its breath hot against his face. Desperation surged through him. He had to survive. He had to get away. In a last-ditch effort, David grabbed the flare gun from his pack and fired it into the air. The flare shot up, blazing bright against the sky, and the bear recoiled for just a moment. It was enough time for David to roll out from beneath the beast, his body screaming in protest as he scrambled to his feet. He didn't wait to see what the bear would do. David turned and bolted, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him, his blood soaking his clothes. His ribs ached, his vision was dizzy, but he kept running. Behind him, the grizzly growled, but it didn't chase. The flare had worked. For now, David ran until his legs gave out, collapsing into a small ravine. His breath came in short, painful gasps. He was alive, but barely. The cuts on his arms and torso were deep, and he felt a cold numbness spreading through his limbs. When search teams found him hours later, barely conscious, they rushed him to safety. His injuries were severe, but he survived. The bear, however, was never seen again, and its attack was chalked up to a combination of territorial instincts and a lack of food after a long winter. The incident sparked renewed concern over bear encounters in the region, with authorities issuing stronger guidelines for hunters and hikers in and locking the doors. That night, as they sat in their camper with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, the reality of what had happened truly set in. Emma and Nathan clung to their mother, still shaken. Laura, her voice steady but soft, reassured them that they were safe now. Mike, sitting at the small table, ran a hand through his hair, staring at the revolver resting beside him. He had faced danger in the wilderness before, but never with his family at his side. The encounter had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. In the days that followed, they continued their trip, though with heightened caution. They spoke to park rangers who confirmed that the area had seen increased bear activity due to a particularly good berry season. The family never ventured far from their vehicle again, and Mike ensured that the bear spray was always in hand. The children eventually returned to their playful selves, though Emma occasionally asked about the bear, her young mind trying to make sense of what had happened. In the vast and rugged wilderness of Amur Oblast, Russia, where the dense taiga stretched endlessly, the autumn of 2011 brought with it a chilling encounter that would leave a permanent mark on those involved. The region, known for its harsh landscapes and elusive wildlife, was home to the formidable Russian grizzly bear. These massive predators roamed freely, their presence a constant reminder of nature's dominance over man. It was here that 3 police officers, Sergeant Viktor Mikhailov, Officer Andrei Petrov, and Officer Leonid Sokolov, set out on what was supposed to be a routine patrol investigating reports of illegal logging deep within the forest. The officers were no strangers to the dangers of the wilderness. Their patrol vehicle, a rugged UAZ 469, bounced over uneven trails as they navigated through thick underbrush. Each man carried a Makarov pistol, standard issue, though they knew such a weapon would do little against the raw power of a grizzly. They also had a Soviet-era flare gun, meant to scare off wildlife, and radios to stay in contact with their station. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and damp earth thick around them as they ventured further into the heart of the taiga. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their boots as they moved cautiously through an area where illegal loggers had been spotted weeks before. As they neared a clearing, a low, guttural growl cut through the silence. The men stopped, their breath visible in the cold air. Standing less than 40 meters away was a massive Russian grizzly, its thick fur matted from weeks of preparation for hibernation. It was emaciated, its ribs faintly visible beneath its powerful frame, a clear sign that food was scarce. The bear's dark eyes locked onto them, and in that moment all 3 officers realized the grim reality of their situation. The bear was not going to back down. Victor, the most experienced of the 3, gestured for the others to slowly back away. They knew better than to run. That would only trigger the bear's predatory instincts. The animal, however, had already made its decision. Without warning, it charged, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Andrei barely had time to unholster his pistol before the bear crashed into him, knocking him to the ground with a force that sent his weapon flying. The beast's claws tore through his jacket, cutting deep into his flesh as he struggled beneath its weight. Leonid and Victor reacted immediately. Victor raised his flare gun and fired, the red-hot signal streaking into the sky. The bear hesitated for a moment, distracted by the sudden burst of light, giving Leonid the chance to grab his baton and strike at the bear's head. It was a desperate move, one that barely fazed the massive predator. The bear turned on Leonid, swiping at him with a paw that sent him sprawling backward, his ribs audibly cracking from the impact. Victor knew they had to act fast. He grabbed his radio and frantically called for backup, his voice shaking as he relayed their coordinates. The bear was still on the offensive, its growls mixing with Andrei's pained gasps. With no other choice, Victor aimed his Makarov at the bear's head and fired. The shot rang through the forest, and for a moment the bear staggered, dazed but not defeated. Enraged, it lunged again, knocking Victor off his feet. The cold ground met him hard, and for a moment his vision blurred as the weight of the bear pressed down on his chest. Then, another shot. A single deafening blast echoed through the trees. Leonid, clutching his side where his ribs had been shattered, managed to retrieve Andrei's fallen pistol and fired at point-blank range. The bullet struck true, and the bear, finally wounded beyond its capacity to fight, let out a deep, guttural growl before stumbling backward. Blood matted its thick fur as it turned and retreated into the underbrush, its heavy footfalls fading into the distance. The officers lay in the dirt, gasping for air, their bodies battered and bleeding. Andre's wounds were the most severe. His arm was torn open, blood pooling beneath him. Despite their efforts, it was clear that he was gravely injured. Leonid's breathing was labored, his broken ribs sending sharp pain through his torso with every movement. Victor, though shaken, forced himself to his feet and kept his pistol trained on the trees, half expecting the bear to return. Minutes felt like hours before the distant sound of an approaching rescue team reached their ears. Park rangers and paramedics arrived, their expressions grim as they assessed the scene. Andre was stabilized, but despite their best efforts, he succumbed to his injuries before he could be airlifted to a hospital. Leonid, despite his broken ribs, managed to walk with assistance, his face pale from shock and pain. Victor, the least injured, gave a full account of the attack, his voice steady despite the horror he had just endured. In the days that followed, local authorities launched an investigation into the bear's unusual aggression. Wildlife experts speculated that the scarcity of food due to changing environmental conditions had driven it to attack. The bear was later found dead a few kilometers away, having succumbed to its wounds. It was a sobering reminder of the fragile balance between humans and nature in the remote wilderness of Amur Oblast. Leonid made a full recovery, though he often joked about his souvenir from the encounter, his permanently misaligned ribs. Victor, despite his years of service, found himself unable to return to deep forest patrols. The memory of the bear's charge, the sheer force of its attack, was something he could never shake. Their brush with death became a legend among local law enforcement, a cautionary tale of the unforgiving wild and the men who dared to walk its paths. In the remote village of Verkhoyansky, nestled at the edge of Siberia's vast wilderness, in 1998, 3 teenage boys ventured along a forest trail for an afternoon of exploration. The village, established in the mid-19th century by fur trappers and later expanded during industrial development, had always maintained an uneasy relationship with the surrounding taiga forest. Local history recounted numerous encounters with wildlife, though serious incidents had been rare in recent decades, as human activity pushed animals deeper into shrinking wilderness areas. Dmitry Volkov, Pyotr Sokolov, and Nikolai Baranov, all aged 16, had grown up together in the tight-knit community of barely 400 residents. Despite frequent warnings from elders about respecting wilderness boundaries, the boys had developed a comfortable familiarity with the forest's edge. That spring afternoon, they traveled along an established path approximately 2 kilometers from the village outskirts, searching for a rumored abandoned weather station. The weather that day had been unusually warm for early May, with temperatures reaching 15 degrees Celsius, drawing many wildlife species out of winter hibernation and into active foraging. The boys had been noisy during their hike, carelessly snapping branches and throwing stones at trees, behavior that would later be cited as potentially attracting attention from predators. Around 3 o'clock, as they crossed into a less frequently traversed section of forest, Pyotr spotted movement in the dense underbrush approximately 30 meters ahead. Before he could alert the others, a massive Ussuri brown bear, sometimes called the Russian grizzly, emerged from between 2 fallen logs. The animal, later estimated by wildlife officials to weigh nearly 800 pounds, stood motionless, assessing the intruders in its territory. The boys froze in terror as survival instincts conflicted with their panic. Nikolai, positioned closest to the bear, made the fatal decision to run. Wildlife experts would later explain that this triggered the bear's predatory chase response. The massive animal charged forward with surprising speed, covering the distance in seconds. Dmitry and Pyotr scattered in opposite directions as Nikolai sprinted toward a clearing that might have offered visibility to the village. The bear overtook Nikolai within 60 meters, striking him from behind with enough force to throw him several feet forward. What happened next occurred largely out of sight of the other boys, though Pyotr, having scrambled up an embankment, witnessed portions of the attack through dense foliage. The bear's assault was brief but catastrophic, causing massive traumatic injuries. Dmitry had fled in the direction of the village, but became disoriented in the thick forest. Piotr, having witnessed the attack's beginning, had retreated in the opposite direction. In his panic, he fell down a steep ravine, suffering a compound fracture to his left leg and multiple lacerations. Despite excruciating pain, he managed to drag himself toward a dilapidated fence, marking an old boundary between village hunting grounds and protected forest. The fence provided minimal protection, but its weathered wooden posts allowed Piotr to pull himself upright. Using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch and fighting against shock and blood loss, he moved painfully along the fence line. Nearly 2 hours after the attack, he located an area where cell reception was strong enough to make an emergency call to the village. Retired hunter Pavel Korznikov was passing near the forest edge on his tractor when he heard faint cries for help. Following the sounds, he discovered Piotr collapsed against the fence, barely conscious from blood loss and exposure. Korznikov immediately transported the injured teenager to the village clinic while alerting local authorities about the attack and Nikolai's unknown status. A search party consisting of village men with hunting experience mobilized within the hour, equipped with rifles and tracking dogs. Led by veteran tracker Yuri Petrov, they located Nikolai's body shortly before dusk. The scene confirmed their worst fears. The teenager had not survived the bear's attack. Dmitry was found several hours later, hiding in a hollow log approximately 1 kilometer from the attack site, physically unharmed but suffering from severe psychological trauma. Wildlife authorities from the regional capital arrived the following day to investigate. Conservation officer Arkady Morozov confirmed through paw print measurements and attack patterns that the animal had been an adult male Ussuri brown bear, likely recently emerged from hibernation and potentially undernourished. Evidence suggested the bear had been startled by the teen's presence rather than stalking them as prey, but had responded with lethal force when Nikolai fled. Piotr underwent multiple surgeries at the regional hospital, eventually recovering from his physical injuries, though requiring extensive rehabilitation for his shattered leg. Psychological recovery proved more challenging, as he experienced severe post-traumatic stress disorder that prevented him from venturing near forested areas for years afterward. The village held a funeral for Nikolai 5 days after the attack. The tragedy profoundly affected the small community, with many families imposing strict restrictions on children's activities outside village boundaries. Local schools implemented enhanced wildlife safety education, emphasizing proper behavior during animal encounters. Regional authorities organized a controlled hunt for the bear, though it was never definitively located. Trail cameras installed after the incident captured images of 3 different adult male bears in the vicinity, suggesting the area supported more predators than previously understood. The village council subsequently established a more robust perimeter fence around populated areas and instituted regular patrols during spring and summer months. The incident received media attention, highlighting the increasing frequency of human-wildlife conflicts in remote regions as development continued to encroach on natural habitats. For the residents of Verkhoyansky, the attack served as a somber reminder of their precarious coexistence with the wilderness, a relationship balanced between necessity and danger, where a moment's carelessness could result in tragedy. In the summer of 2025, a fishing expedition to the remote wilderness of Hudson Bay seemed like the perfect escape for 3 seasoned men: Derek, Mark, and Alan. They had all been on numerous fishing trips before, but this one was different. The allure of the cold, pristine waters and the chance to experience the untamed wilderness of Canada's far north was irresistible. Hudson Bay was known not only for its breathtaking beauty, but also for its polar bears, and the men had prepared themselves for the potential dangers of such a remote, wild location. They arrived and quickly set up camp on the edge of the bay, where the low sun of late summer cast long shadows over the ice and water. The air was crisp and clean, and the men wasted no time in setting up their fishing gear. The first few hours passed in relative silence, broken only by the quiet splash of fish being caught and the occasional crack of settling ice. They fished not just for sport, but for the joy of being in such an isolated place. The beauty of the surroundings, almost enough to make them forget the potential dangers that lurked nearby. As the day wore on, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, but But the men continued fishing. They had caught a good number of fish, and their campfire was already crackling, promising a hot meal later in the evening. It was a peaceful moment, one that made them feel even more connected to the land, as though the bay itself was welcoming them into its ancient embrace. But as the men gathered around the campfire to cook their catch, the air shifted. A strange feeling settled over Derek, a sense of being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hidden in the vast emptiness of the snow-covered landscape. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the unease lingered, gnawing at him as he glanced out across the icy expanse. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a distant shadow, barely visible against the white canvas. But as he focused, the shape grew larger, moving steadily toward the camp. It was unmistakable, a massive polar bear, its white fur blending almost perfectly with the snowy surroundings, yet its size and movement unmistakable. The bear was heading straight for them. Panic surged through Derek as he turned back to the camp. His mind raced. He knew polar bears were attracted to food, and they had plenty of fish cooking over the fire. The bear had likely smelled it from miles away and was now drawn to the camp, its instincts guiding it toward an easy meal. Derek's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly turned to Mark and Alan, but they had already seen the bear, their faces pale with the realization of what was happening. The men immediately sprang into action, grabbing their gear and preparing for the worst. They had rifles and bear spray, but the realization that the bear was already so close made it feel as though they were too late. The bear continued its steady march toward them, its large paws leaving deep imprints in the snow. Its eyes were locked on the camp, its focus unwavering, and there was no mistaking the hunger and curiosity that drove every step. As the bear drew closer, Derek could feel the ground beneath him vibrate with each step the massive animal took. The men moved quickly, heading for their boats on the water, their only hope of escape. The distance to the boats wasn't far, but in the face of such an immediate threat, every step felt like an eternity. Before they could reach the boats, the bear was upon them. It was a blur of power and speed as the bear lunged, its claws extended and its jaws snapping. Derek barely managed to dive to the side, avoiding the bear's initial swipe by mere inches. His heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, trying to gain some distance between himself and the predator. Mark and Alan fired warning shots into the air, hoping to scare the bear off, but the sound seemed only to agitate it further. The bear let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing as it locked onto them with renewed determination. It charged again, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. Derek barely had time to react as the bear's claws slashed through the air, just missing him as he ducked. Alan and Mark tried to make themselves appear larger, shouting and waving their arms, but it only seemed to enrage the bear more. Derek reached for the bear spray, his hands shaking as he tried to aim the canister. He fired, releasing a cloud of spray that hit the bear square in the face. The bear recoiled, momentarily stunned, its eyes wide with pain and confusion. It hesitated, giving the men a brief moment to move, but the hesitation was short-lived. With a roar, the bear charged again, faster this time, its massive body cutting through the snow like a freight train. The men ran, their only thought now the boats. They could hear the bear's footsteps pounding behind them, its growls and snarls growing louder as it closed the distance. The cold air burned their lungs as they pushed their bodies harder, their fear propelling them forward. Derek felt his legs weaken with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. There was no other choice. The boats were within reach, the men's salvation. Derek and Mark jumped in first, quickly pushing off into the water. Alan followed, but as he stepped into his boat, the bear lunged at him, its claws raking across the edge of the boat. Alan fell backward, hitting the water with a splash. The bear's jaws snapped shut just inches from him, but Alan scrambled back into the boat, and with one final desperate push, the men were free from the shore. The bear stopped at the water's edge, its eyes watching them for a moment before it turned and disappeared back into the wilderness. Exhausted, battered, and shaken, the men paddled furiously, putting as much distance between themselves and the bear as possible. The adrenaline still coursed through their veins, but as the bear faded from view, they allowed themselves to pause. The danger was over, but the encounter had left them rattled, their minds racing with the realization of how close they had come to death. The land they had entered was not just beautiful, it was unforgiving, and the creatures that roamed it would not hesitate to claim what they desired. In the frigid waters surrounding Kodiak Island, Alaska, in 1979, commercial fisherman Theodore Reinhardt encountered a situation so extraordinary that it would be recounted in maritime folklore for decades. Kodiak, located in the northern Gulf of Alaska, had been home to indigenous Alutiiq people for thousands of years before Russian colonization in the 18th century. Named for its massive brown bears, the largest subspecies of grizzly in the world, Kodiak's wilderness represented one of North America's last truly wild frontiers. Reinhardt, a 37-year-old third-generation fisherman of German Alutiiq descent, had been working these waters since adolescence. On that September morning, he set out alone in his 18-foot skiff, the Mariner's Dream, to check his crab pots in Kuprianov Strait, a narrow channel separating Kodiak from neighboring Afognak Island. The weather had been unusually clear with light winds, perfect conditions for the small vessel. The crossing between islands normally took approximately 40 minutes. Reinhardt had completed this journey hundreds of times throughout his career, familiar with every current and hidden reef. He had just passed the halfway point when he noticed something unusual in the water about 200 yards ahead, a dark object moving deliberately against the current. Initially, Reinhardt assumed it was a sea lion or perhaps a small whale, common sights in these productive waters. However, as the distance closed, he realized with astonishment that he was observing a massive Kodiak bear swimming across the channel. While bears occasionally swam between islands, witnessing one this far from shore was extremely rare. The animal appeared to be a mature male, its wet fur plastered against a frame that likely exceeded 1,100 pounds on land. Wildlife biologists would later speculate that unusually strong tidal currents had likely pulled the bear off course during what should have been a routine crossing at a narrower point of the strait. By the time Reinhardt encountered it, the animal had been swimming for possibly several hours and showed signs of exhaustion. Reinhardt reduced his engine speed and maintained distance, intending to observe the magnificent creature without disturbing its journey. He had been taught from childhood to respect the apex predators that shared the Kodiak archipelago. However, the situation rapidly deteriorated when the bear altered course, swimming directly toward the small boat. Whether drawn by curiosity, desperation for rest, or confusion due to exhaustion, remained unknown. What became immediately clear was the danger presented by an exhausted 1,000-pound predator attempting to board a vessel barely twice its length. Reinhardt increased throttle to create distance, but the bear pursued with surprising speed despite its fatigue. Within minutes, the animal reached the skiff's port side. Reinhardt quickly maneuvered to prevent the bear from gaining a foothold, but the creature's massive front paws gripped the gunwale. The small boat tilted dangerously under the sudden shift in weight. In a desperate attempt to counterbalance, Reinhardt cut the engine and shifted the skiff to starboard, hoping to regain control. But the bear's relentless efforts caused the vessel to capsize entirely. Thrown into 43-degree water, Reinhardt surfaced to find himself separated from the overturned skiff by about 15 feet, with the massive bear between them. In the ensuing confusion, the panicked animal, struggling to stay afloat, perceived Reinhardt's thrashing as a threat. It lunged toward him, slashing out with powerful paws in what wildlife experts would later describe as defensive behavior rather than predatory. Fighting hypothermia in the frigid water, Reinhardt spotted a floating wooden oar that had been dislodged from his vessel. As the bear approached again, he struck it repeatedly across the sensitive nose area. After several blows, the disoriented animal swam away, heading roughly toward Afognak Island, though clearly struggling against both the current and its exhaustion. Reinhardt, nearing hypothermia after nearly 20 minutes in the water, managed to reach his overturned skiff. Though unable to right the boat, he clung to the exposed hull for flotation. The emergency positioning beacon on his life vest had activated upon immersion, alerting Coast Guard authorities to his location. Nearly an hour later, the commercial fishing vessel, Northern Light, captained by Josephine Holloway, spotted the overturned skiff while returning from halibut grounds. Holloway and her crew rescued the severely hypothermic Reinhardt, administering emergency first aid and radioing for medical evacuation. Despite his core body temperature dropping to dangerous levels, Reinhardt survived, though with moderate lacerations to his left arm and shoulder from the bear's claws. The fate of the bear remained unknown. Search flights the following day found no sign of the animal along nearby shorelines. Marine biologists from the University of Alaska theorized that, given its exhaustion and the distance remaining to shore, the bear likely drowned, though its remarkable swimming endurance meant survival was still a possibility. Reinhardt's extraordinary encounter quickly spread through Kodiak's tight-knit fishing community. Initially met with skepticism, his account gained credibility when distinct claw marks matching Kodiak bear patterns were found on the recovered skiff. Maritime authorities officially documented the incident in their quarterly safety bulletin, creating the first record of a bear vessel interaction in open Alaskan waters. After 6 weeks of recovery, Reinhardt returned to fishing, but never again in a vessel smaller than 30 feet. He installed additional safety equipment and modified his routes to avoid known bear crossing points between islands. His experience led the Kodiak Fishermen's Association to include wildlife encounter protocols in their safety training programs. The incident became locally famous, eventually featured in Alaska Geographic magazine under the headline, "When Wilderness Swims." For Kodiak residents, Reinhardt's survival story served as a powerful reminder. Even on their remote island, the line between human domain and wilderness remained permeable and uncertain. At sea, the massive predators that gave the island its fearsome reputation could suddenly transform from distant wildlife into immediate, life-threatening reality. Park in Alberta, Canada was a vast, breathtaking expanse of wilderness where the jagged peaks of the Rockies towered over dense pine forests and crystalline lakes. It was the summer of 2014, and the warm air carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Tourists flocked to the region during this time, eager to hike the scenic trails and witness the untamed beauty of nature. Among them were 45-year-old Sarah Green and her longtime friend Andrew Caldwell, both avid hikers who had spent years exploring trails across North America. They had set out that morning with a simple plan: follow the well-marked trail leading to a popular lookout point. Sarah carried a small backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit, while Andrew had a map and a pocket knife clipped to his belt. The sun filtered through the towering first as they walked, casting shifting patterns on the ground. The sound of bird song and the distant rush of a stream accompanied their conversation, making the wilderness feel almost tranquil. However, curiosity led them astray. Along the way, Andrew spotted a waterfall in the distance, its shimmering cascade partially hidden by the dense trees. He suggested they take a short detour to get a better view. Sarah hesitated at first, knowing that venturing off the main trail was never a good idea, but the promise of a stunning sight convinced her. They veered off the path, pushing through thick underbrush and stepping over fallen logs, assuming they could easily find their way back. What they didn't realize was that they were heading straight into prime bear territory. This section of the forest, untouched by the steady stream of human traffic, was home to one of Wild Pine's most formidable predators, the grizzly bear. As they moved deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of the trail faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. The only noise was the crunch of their boots and the occasional snap of a twig beneath their feet. Sarah suddenly became aware of an odd stillness in the air, as if the forest itself had paused. Then came the unmistakable sound of heavy movement through the undergrowth, a deep, rhythmic rustling that sent a chill down her spine. She barely had time to turn her head when the massive grizzly emerged from behind a thicket, its dark eyes locked onto them. The bear was enormous, easily weighing over 700 pounds, with powerful shoulders and thick, golden-brown fur. It had likely been foraging when their presence startled it. Sarah instinctively reached for her bear spray, but in her haste, she realized with dread that it was buried deep in her backpack. The delay was costly. The bear charged. Sarah barely had time to react before the beast was upon her. She turned to run, but the bear moved with terrifying speed. It crashed into her with full force, knocking her to the ground like she weighed nothing. The impact sent pain shooting through her body as she landed hard on her side. Before she could scramble away, the bear's massive claws raked across her arm and shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh. Blood welled instantly, and she let out a choked scream. Andrew, who had instinctively backed away, knew he had only seconds to act. He shouted at the top of his lungs, waving his arms frantically in an attempt to divert the bear's attention. His voice, loud and desperate, momentarily startled the animal. The grizzly hesitated, glancing toward him, giving Sarah just enough time to roll away and push herself up with her good arm. She stumbled toward a nearby tree, her breath ragged, pain searing through her wounds. The bear, now agitated and confused, turned its focus back on Andrew. He grabbed a fallen branch and swung it wildly, stepping backward with calculated movements, knowing that a sudden turn might provoke another charge. The bear huffed, snapping its jaws, but the momentary distraction had worked. Sarah, clutching her bleeding arm, dug into her backpack with trembling fingers and finally retrieved the bear spray. With her heart pounding, she aimed and fired a thick cloud directly at the bear's face. The grizzly roared, shaking its massive head as the burning spray took effect. It let out a deep guttural growl and backed away, its powerful limbs retreating into the shadows of the trees. Seconds stretched into eternity before the sound of its heavy footfalls faded completely. Both Sarah and Andrew stood frozen, their chests heaving with exertion. The smell of bear spray lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic scent of Sarah's blood. She swayed slightly, her face pale from pain and adrenaline. Andrew rushed to her side, tearing a strip from his shirt to wrap around her wounded arm. They had to move, fast. Relying on their instincts, they retraced their steps, pushing through the dense foliage until they stumbled back onto the main trail. Sarah's breathing was ragged, and her injured arm throbbed with each movement, but the sight of a ranger station in the distance filled her with relief. They reached it within minutes, calling for help. The rangers acted quickly, dressing Sarah's wounds and preparing her for evacuation. She was taken to a nearby hospital where doctors stitched the deep lacerations and treated her for shock. Despite the pain and trauma, she was lucky. She had survived an encounter with one of nature's most formidable predators. In the aftermath, wildlife officials investigated the area and confirmed that they had indeed wandered into a high-risk bear zone. They noted that the bear had likely been startled and reacted out of instinct rather than predation. The incident served as a sobering reminder to all hikers. Nature was unpredictable, and even experienced outdoors people were not immune to its dangers. Sarah, forever marked by the deep scars along her arm, would recount the story to fellow hikers, emphasizing the importance of preparedness. The wilderness was breathtaking, but it demanded respect, and for those who took it lightly, the consequences could be deadly. She had learned that lesson the hard way, but she had lived to tell the tale. In the mist-shrouded wilderness, 2017, a seasoned hiking group encountered the lethal unpredictability of a landscape known for its abundant wildlife. The region, often called a Serengeti for its diverse animal population, had been established as protected territory decades earlier, allowing natural predator-prey relationships to recover after near eradication in the early 20th century. The area's large carnivore population had slowly rebounded, a conservation success that occasionally resulted in dangerous human encounters. The hiking party consisted of 5 experienced outdoor enthusiasts: group leader Harrison Montgomery, wildlife photographer Camilla Nakamura, retired geology professor Edmund Webster, emergency room physician Alexandra Kostopoulos, and Forest Service volunteer Jeremiah Blackwell. All had completed advanced wilderness training and had previously hiked in bear country without incident. Their planned route traversed an established trail through a remote valley, requiring permits due to its isolated nature. The group had departed from the trailhead shortly after sunrise, hoping to reach their designated camping area by mid-afternoon. Weather conditions initially seemed favorable, with cool temperatures and a light breeze, ideal for the 8-mile hike ahead. However, as they descended into the valley at approximately 8:45 a.m., they encountered an unusual weather phenomenon common to the region, a dense ground fog that reduced visibility to less than 20 feet. Montgomery, with 15 years of backcountry experience, called a brief conference. Standard procedure recommended waiting for the fog to lift rather than continuing with limited visibility in predator territory. However, weather reports via satellite phone indicated the condition might persist throughout the day. After discussion, the group decided to proceed cautiously, maintaining tight formation and making noise consistently to alert wildlife to their presence. For 40 minutes, they navigated through the ethereal landscape, regularly calling out and striking their trekking poles against trees to announce their presence. As they crossed a sloping meadow approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, the fog briefly thinned, revealing ghostly silhouettes of grazing elk in the distance. The group paused to observe and photograph the animals, temporarily lowering their guard and noise level. Montgomery, walking point position approximately 10 feet ahead of the others, crossed over a slight rise in the terrain. What happened next occurred with shocking speed. A massive grizzly bear, later estimated by wildlife experts to weigh approximately 600 pounds, erupted from the fog less than 15 feet from Montgomery's position. The animal had been feeding on an elk carcass concealed by tall grass, a kill it was aggressively defending. The group's noise approach had actually worsened the situation. Rather than giving the bear an opportunity to retreat unconfronted, they had effectively cornered it at its food source. The grizzly charged instantly, covering the short distance to Montgomery before he could deploy his bear spray. The initial impact knocked him backward, and the bear's powerful jaws clamped onto his upper thigh, inflicting catastrophic damage to the femoral artery. The remaining hikers reacted with textbook precision despite their horror. Dr. Kostopoulos immediately deployed bear spray, creating a defensive chemical cloud while shouting commands to the others. Blackwell activated his emergency satellite beacon while Nakamura and Webster hastily retreated several yards, creating escape space for the animal. The bear released Montgomery and vanished into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. The entire attack lasted approximately 12 seconds, but the damage was severe. Montgomery lay unconscious and rapidly exsanguinating from his leg wound. Dr. Kostopoulos applied immediate pressure to the femoral artery while directing the others to establish a perimeter with additional bear spray ready. Despite Dr. Kostopoulos' medical intervention, Montgomery's injuries proved fatal within minutes. The femoral artery damage too extensive for field treatment. The remaining hikers maintained defensive positions around their fallen companion, deeply shaken but disciplined in following emergency protocols. The bear, having established territorial dominance, did not return, though movement could be heard periodically in the surrounding fog. Emergency response, alerted by the satellite beacon, arrived via helicopter approximately 57 minutes after the attack. Poor visibility required the aircraft to land nearly half a mile from the group's position. Ranger Teresa Callahan led a 4-person armed response team through the fog, locating the hikers through radio communication. Montgomery's body was evacuated, while the remaining hikers were escorted to safety. Subsequent investigation revealed the grizzly had killed an elk approximately 18 hours before the encounter and had been guarding its cache, behavior consistent with natural feeding patterns rather than predatory aggression toward humans. Wildlife biologists identified the animal through DNA samples as a 12-year-old male with no previous history of human conflict. The tragedy sparked renewed debate about wilderness management policies. Some activists called for increased trail closures during fog conditions, while others emphasized that Montgomery's group had followed most recommended protocols. Authorities ultimately implemented enhanced warning systems at trailheads regarding weather conditions and increased mandatory distances from established trails during periods of reduced visibility. For the survivors, the psychological impact proved significant. Dr. Kostopoulos took extended leave from her medical practice, struggling with dreams of patients she couldn't save. Nakamura's subsequent photography exhibition, Threshold, Light and Shadow in Wild Places, explored themes of beauty and danger existing simultaneously. Webster incorporated the experience into his university lectures, emphasizing that wilderness knowledge must include accepting its inherent risks. Jeremiah Blackwell, perhaps most affected, left his volunteer position with the Forest Service and became an advocate for enhanced emergency communication systems in wilderness areas. His testimony before a governmental subcommittee on park safety helped secure funding for an expanded network of emergency beacons throughout backcountry trails. The incident served as a somber reminder to wilderness enthusiasts that in wild places, fog wasn't just weather, it was a deadly curtain that could hide death just a few steps away. Despite all human precautions and experience, wild places remain truly wild, operating under ancient rules where humans were neither apex predator nor privileged visitor, but simply another species moving through dangerous terrain. The dense forests of the Russian Far East, the air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. It was the summer of 2007, and the Sikhote Alin mountain range stood in its rugged grandeur, an untouched wilderness stretching for miles. This region was known for its pristine beauty and formidable predators. Few dared to venture deep into these woods without proper precautions. The territory was ruled by nature alone, and those who entered it did so at their own risk. 3 women, Yulia Mikhailova, Anastasia Petrova, and Irina Volkova, had set out on a hiking trip, drawn by the allure of the remote landscape. They were experienced outdoors women but had never encountered a Russian grizzly in the wild before. The trio moved along a narrow trail, weaving through towering cedars and birches, their boots crunching on loose gravel. The sound of a river flowing nearby was a reassuring constant in the eerie silence of the forest. They had packed light, their backpacks carrying only the essentials: water bottles, some food, and basic first aid supplies. None of them had thought to bring a firearm or bear spray, believing the chances of an encounter were slim. They had read about grizzlies in books and seen them from afar, but no amount of second-hand knowledge could prepare someone for the raw reality of such an encounter. As they reached the riverbank, a family of hikers on the opposite side noticed movement in the underbrush. A man, Sergei Ivanov, an experienced outdoorsman himself, instinctively recognized the signs of a large predator. He saw the flicker of a massive shadow moving swiftly between the trees. Without hesitation, he shouted across the river, waving his arms in warning. But the women, distracted by their own conversation, had barely registered his urgency when the beast emerged. The Russian grizzly was a monstrous creature, easily standing over 9 feet tall on its hind legs. Its fur a thick, dark brown with flecks of golden sheen. Its sheer size and power were enough to freeze anyone in their tracks. The bear had likely been surprised by the hikers' sudden presence, and in a swift, deadly decision, it charged. The force of its movement sent vibrations through the ground, a terrifying rumble that could be felt even before the full horror of the situation set in. The 3 women barely had time to react. In a matter of seconds, the attack began, and it would last only 2 minutes, 2 minutes that felt like an eternity. Yulia reacted first, turning on her heel to flee, but the uneven terrain betrayed her. She barely made it a few steps before she tripped over an exposed tree root. The bear was on her in an instant, its massive claws raking across her back as she screamed. The deep gashes it inflicted were enough to immobilize her, but the bear did not stop there. With a force that seemed almost unnatural, it bit down on her shoulder, shaking her violently as if she were no more than a rag doll. Her cries echoed through the trees before fading into a sickening gurgle. Irina, just behind her, tried to run in the opposite direction, but the bear lunged, knocking her to the ground. The sickening sound of bones cracking filled the air as the predator tore into her. Sergei watched from across the river, helpless as the scene unfolded. The sheer brutality of the attack was overwhelming. He had seen bear attacks before, but never had he witnessed such swift and ruthless carnage. The bear had not hesitated, had not paused. It had acted on pure primal instinct. Anastasia, gripped by terror, did the only thing she could think of. She scrambled up the nearest tree. She climbed desperately, her fingers clawing at the bark as the bear finished with Irina and turned its attention to her. Sergei and his family watched in horror as the beast stood on its hind legs, reaching up with powerful swipes. It took only moments for the bear to snag Anastasia's foot and drag her down. Her body tumbled through the branches before she hit the ground hard. The impact alone might have been fatal, but the bear ensured it was. Its jaws clamped down on her neck, shaking her limp body before tossing her aside like discarded prey. Sergei, driven by sheer instinct, grabbed stones and hurled them at the bear, shouting as loudly as he could. His wife and children joined in, their voices rising in desperation. The bear, momentarily distracted, finally retreated into the depths of the forest. But the damage had been done. The clearing was left silent except for the rushing river, its water now carrying the distant echoes of what had transpired. By the time rescue teams arrived, hours had passed. There was nothing they could do. The bodies of the three women lay in the clearing, a grim reminder of the unforgiving nature of the wild. The authorities later speculated that the bear had likely been on edge due to a lack of food in the area, making it more aggressive than usual. It was a known risk in this part of the wilderness. When food became scarce, even the most elusive predators took desperate measures. The incident sent shockwaves through the hiking community, serving as a stark warning to anyone who underestimated the dangers of the wilderness. Sergei, haunted by what he had witnessed, would later tell the story to anyone who would listen, hoping to prevent another tragedy. He would relive the images of that day in his nightmares, the brutal swiftness of the attack, the sheer helplessness of standing on the other side of the river, separated by nothing more than a strip of water, but unable to intervene. The forest remained unchanged, its beauty masking the peril that lurked within, as it always had, as it always would. The wilderness was a realm of its own, one that did not forgive mistakes, one that did not mourn the dead. The remote wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and salt carried by the ocean breeze. It was the autumn of 1996, a season when the island's massive Kodiak bears, the largest of their species, were preparing for hibernation. The dense forests and rugged terrain stretched endlessly, a wild and untamed land where nature reigned supreme. Dr. Sarah Benson, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist, had spent weeks here, tracking and studying the island's bear population. Her research focused on their behavior and migration patterns, an ambitious project that required her to venture into the most isolated parts of the island, where human presence was scarce. Sarah was no stranger to the dangers that came with her work. She had studied grizzlies in Montana and wolves in Yellowstone, but Kodiak bears were a different challenge entirely. Towering over 10 feet when standing on their hind legs and weighing up to 1,500 pounds, these bears were apex predators in their domain. Her base camp was set up near a salmon-rich stream where she had been monitoring bear activity. She relied on a combination of field notes, motion-triggered cameras, and direct observations, often hiking miles into the wilderness alone. She carried a satellite phone, a rifle for emergencies, and bear spray, though she hoped she would never have to use them. On that particular morning, she had ventured farther than usual, following fresh tracks in the damp soil. The signs were unmistakable: deep imprints, claw marks on nearby trees, and fresh scat indicating that a large male bear had recently passed through. She moved cautiously, scanning her surroundings and making her presence known by speaking aloud at regular intervals, a precaution to avoid startling any bears. The autumn foliage glowed in shades of gold and crimson, and the distant call of ravens echoed through the crisp air. The environment was breathtaking, but she never allowed herself to be lulled into a false sense of security. As she neared a thick patch of alder bushes, a rustling sound made her stop in her tracks. Her pulse quickened. She knew better than to panic, but every nerve in her body screamed at her to retreat. Slowly, she reached for her bear spray, keeping her movements deliberate. Just as she was about to step back, the massive form of a Kodiak bear emerged from the undergrowth, no more than 20 feet away. It was a dominant male, its fur a rich shade of brown, thick from the season's abundant feeding. The bear's eyes locked onto hers, its muscles tensed, and in that moment, she realized she had unwittingly entered its personal space. The next few seconds unraveled in a blur of instinct and adrenaline. The bear's posture changed, its ears flattened, and its lips curled back, revealing powerful teeth. Sarah knew this was not a bluff charge. She had spent years studying bear behavior, and every signal this bear displayed indicated aggression. It had been startled, and now it saw her as a threat. Without hesitation, the bear launched forward, closing the short distance between them with terrifying speed. Sarah reacted on pure survival instinct. She turned and sprinted toward the nearest tree, knowing that climbing was her only option. She had read accounts of bears scaling trees, but she also knew that a Kodiak's bulk made vertical pursuit difficult. Her boots dug into the damp earth as she propelled herself upward, gripping the rough bark with desperation. Just as she pulled herself onto a low branch, she felt a searing pain in her leg. The bear had swiped at her, its claws tearing through her pants and raking deep into her calf. She let out a strangled cry, but didn't stop. Higher, she had to get higher, The bear, frustrated by her escape, reared up on its hind legs and batted at the trunk, sending vibrations through the entire tree. Sarah clung to the branch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The pain in her leg was excruciating, but she forced herself to stay still, not wanting to provoke another attack. The bear circled beneath her, huffing and growling, its immense body a reminder of just how powerless she was in this situation. She reached for her radio, her fingers trembling as she fumbled to turn it on. Static crackled in her ear before she managed to send out a distress call. Minutes passed like hours as she remained perched in the tree, watching the bear's every movement. It pawed at the ground, its agitation evident, but eventually it began to lose interest. Perhaps realizing she was no longer an immediate threat, it turned and ambled toward the stream, disappearing into the dense foliage. Sarah exhaled shakily, her entire body trembling from the rush of adrenaline. She knew she couldn't climb down too soon. The bear could still be nearby, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, she cautiously made her descent, her injured leg protesting with each movement. Blood soaked through her torn pant leg, but she pushed the pain aside. She needed to get to higher ground where she could get a clearer signal for her radio. Each step was agonizing, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that staying put was not an option. Her mind raced with the grim possibility of infection or blood loss, but she forced herself to stay focused. By the time she reached an open ridge, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. She sent out another distress signal, her voice hoarse as she relayed her coordinates. Relief washed over her when a voice crackled back, confirming that a rescue team was en route. She sank onto the cold ground, exhaustion overtaking her as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She had come face to face with one of the most powerful predators on the planet and survived. Hours later, the distant sound of a helicopter broke the silence. A team of park rangers and medics descended upon her location, their expressions a mix of concern and admiration. She was stabilized and airlifted to safety, where she underwent surgery for her injuries. The wounds on her leg were deep, but they would heal. The psychological scars, however, would take longer to fade. In the aftermath of the attack, Sarah's story became a cautionary tale among researchers and hikers alike. She had done everything right, yet still she had come terrifyingly close to becoming another statistic. It was a reminder that in the wild, even the most experienced could find themselves at the mercy of nature's unpredictable forces. Despite the ordeal, she refused to let fear dictate her future. Once recovered, she returned to the field, more determined than ever to continue her work. Kodiak Island remained as wild and untamed as ever, its bears continuing their ancient existence, indifferent to the fleeting presence of those who dared to study the vast wilderness of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, where towering spruce trees lined the rugged landscape and glacial rivers cut through the valley floors. Mike Caldwell and his wife Laura had embarked on what was meant to be a peaceful road trip with their two young children, 7-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Nathan. It was the summer of 2011, a time when long daylight hours illuminated the pristine beauty of the Alaskan backcountry. The family, originally from Oregon, had planned this trip for months, eager to experience the untamed beauty of the North. Mike, an avid outdoorsman, had spent years hunting elk and deer in the lower 48 states. But this trip was about something different: exploration and family bonding. After several days of traveling in their camper, they decided to stop near Skilak Lake for a short hike. The area was known for its breathtaking views and vibrant wildlife. They followed a well-marked trail that wound through dense undergrowth, their boots crunching over pine needles and damp earth. The children, full of energy, ran ahead, stopping occasionally to examine wildflowers or point out birds flitting through the trees. Laura carried bear spray on her belt, and Mike had his .44 Magnum revolver holstered at his side, a precaution he never took lightly when traveling in bear country. The family was aware of the risks, but felt confident in their preparation. As they approached a meadow where wild berries grew in thick clusters, Emma let out an excited squeal, pointing at the bushes. The children rushed forward, eager to pluck the ripe fruit. Laura hesitated for a moment, scanning the area, but saw no immediate danger. The scene was idyllic, the sun casting a golden glow over the clearing, a light breeze rustling through the leaves. For a brief moment, they let their guard down. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A rustling noise deep in the thickets, barely perceptible over the sound of their children's laughter. Mike, always attuned to his surroundings, turned sharply in the direction of the noise. His stomach tightened as he spotted movement within the dense foliage. A massive black bear, its dark fur almost blending with the shadows, was emerging from the undergrowth. It was no more than 40 yards away, its snout twitching as it sniffed the air. The family had unknowingly wandered into its feeding area. Instinct took over. Mike's voice, firm but controlled, ordered the children to get behind him. Laura grabbed Nathan's hand, pulling him close. Emma, sensing the tension, stood frozen, her small hand gripping her mother's jacket. The bear, now fully visible, was larger than any black bear Mike had ever seen. It was clear from its posture that it wasn't merely passing through, it had been feeding and was now evaluating the family's presence. Mike raised his arms and spoke in a low, steady voice, trying to make himself appear larger. He knew running would trigger the bear's predatory instincts, but he also knew they were too close for comfort. The bear took a step forward, huffing loudly, its ears pinned back. Mike's grip tightened around the handle of his revolver, but he hesitated to draw it. Shooting a bear was a last resort, not something he wanted his children to witness. Laura, heart pounding, slowly reached for the bear spray at her side. Before she could remove the safety clip, Emma let out a small whimper. The sound was enough to change everything. The bear, previously hesitant, suddenly charged. Mike barely had time to react. In one swift motion, he unholstered his revolver and fired a warning shot into the ground. The deafening blast echoed through the trees. The bear skidded to a halt, momentarily startled, its dark eyes locked onto him. It huffed again, swaying its massive head from side to side. Mike took a slow step backward, motioning for Laura to do the same. The children clung to their mother, too terrified to make a sound. Seconds stretched into eternity as the bear remained still, weighing its next move. Then, just as quickly as it had charged, it turned, disappearing back into the thick underbrush. The sudden stillness was almost surreal. Mike exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. Laura's hand was trembling as she gripped the bear spray, still unused. The children were silent, their wide eyes filled with fear. Wasting no time, Mike ushered his family back onto the trail, keeping his revolver at the ready. He forced himself to walk at a controlled pace, knowing that panic could cause more harm than good. The hike back to their vehicle felt longer than it should have, every sound in the forest magnified in their heightened state. When they finally reached the camper, Laura broke down, pulling the children into a tight embrace. Mike took one last wary glance toward the trees before climbing in and locking the doors. That night, as they sat in their camper with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, the reality of what had happened truly set in. Emma and Nathan clung to their mother, still shaken. Laura, her voice steady but soft, reassured them that they were safe now. Mike, sitting at the small table, ran a hand through his hair, staring at the revolver resting beside him. He had faced danger in the wilderness before, but never with his family at his side. The encounter had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. In the days that followed, they continued their trip, though with heightened caution. They spoke to park rangers who confirmed that the area had seen increased bear activity due to a particularly good berry season. The family never ventured far from their vehicle again, and Mike ensured that the bear spray was always in hand. The children eventually returned to their playful selves. Though Emma occasionally asked about the bear, her young mind trying to make sense of what had happened. In the rugged backcountry of Colorado, 1995, a volunteer search and rescue team experienced a harrowing confrontation that would forever change wilderness emergency protocols. The area, characterized by steep ravines and dense pine forests, had historically been prime grizzly habitat before the species' extirpation in the 1950s. However, unconfirmed sightings in recent years had suggested possible natural recolonization from neighboring regions, reports largely dismissed by wildlife authorities as mistaken black bear identifications. The 5-person team had been dispatched to locate Charles and Marianne Hendrickson, experienced hikers from Minnesota, who had failed to return from a 3-day trek in the park's remote northwestern section. The search team consisted of team leader Bradford Wellington, a 20-year veteran of mountain rescues, medical technician Veronica Sandoval, communications specialist Timothy Zhao, wilderness guide Ophelia Jenkins, and Nathaniel Hollister, a former park ranger with extensive tracking experience. All had completed advanced wilderness first aid training and participated in numerous previous rescues in similar terrain. Their search began at the trailhead, following the Hendricksons' registered route plan. They maintained regular radio contact with base operations as they ascended beyond the tree line, methodically checking potential emergency campsites and shelter locations. After 8 hours of searching, Hollister discovered boot prints matching the missing hiker's pattern, descending off-trail toward a densely forested drainage, possibly indicating an attempt to seek shelter from the previous day's thunderstorms. Following this promising lead, the team descended into the ravine as afternoon shadows lengthened across the landscape. At approximately 5:40 p.m., they entered a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines and discovered the Hendricksons' tent, damaged but intact, with supplies scattered nearby. Evidence suggested a hasty departure rather than animal damage, raising hopes the hikers might be found alive. Wellington instructed the team to establish a perimeter and begin methodical search patterns radiating from the campsite. Hollister and Sandoval took the northern quadrant, moving carefully through thick underbrush while calling the missing hikers' names. Approximately 200 yards from camp, they discovered fresh bear scat containing fabric scraps, an ominous sign that immediately elevated their concern. Hollister radioed Wellington with this development, and the team regrouped to reassess. While discussing next steps, they heard rustling in the vegetation approximately 30 yards east of their position. Initially hoping it might be the missing hikers, they were instead confronted by a massive grizzly bear emerging from behind a fallen tree. Later analysis of paw prints and witness descriptions confirmed what seemed impossible. A mature male grizzly, estimated at 650 pounds, had indeed recolonized this area. The animal likely protecting a nearby food cache containing the hikers' remains, charged without warning. Hollister, positioned closest to the animal's approach, had no time to deploy defense measures before the bear struck him with tremendous force, knocking him into a rocky outcropping and immediately mauling his torso and legs. Wellington and Jenkins simultaneously deployed bear spray, creating a defensive chemical cloud that temporarily drove the animal back. Zhao activated emergency protocols via radio, while Sandoval pulled medical supplies from her pack. The team dragged the severely injured Hollister toward a natural stone formation that offered partial protection on 3 sides. The bear, briefly disoriented by the pepper spray, retreated approximately 50 yards before circling back. Jenkins deployed a marine flare, creating both a visual and auditory deterrent that again temporarily repelled the animal. For nearly 45 minutes, the team alternated between treating Hollister's massive injuries and defending their position as the bear made repeated approach attempts from different angles. Sandoval's emergency medical training proved critical. Despite limited supplies, she managed to control Hollister's arterial bleeding and stabilize his condition enough to prevent immediate death. Wellington maintained constant communication with park headquarters, where rangers were organizing an armed response team and helicopter evacuation. As darkness approached, the bear's persistence increased. During one particularly aggressive charge, the animal came within 6 feet of the group before Jenkins struck it directly in the face with her aluminum trekking pole, momentarily stunning it. Wellington followed with a direct blast of bear spray to the animal's eyes and nasal passages, finally convincing it to abandon the confrontation. Rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, using spotlights to locate the team. 2 ranger paramedics rappelled from the aircraft, while their colleagues provided armed security against potential bear return. Hollister, barely conscious and having lost dangerous amounts of blood, was evacuated first, followed by the remaining team members. At Denver Medical Center, surgeons worked for 11 hours to repair Hollister's extensive injuries, including compound fractures to both legs, severe lacerations across his torso and face, and internal organ damage. Though he survived, his recovery required 14 additional surgeries over 2 years, leaving him with permanent mobility limitations and extensive scarring. The fate of the Hendricksons was confirmed 3 days later when a heavily armed recovery team located their remains approximately a quarter mile from their campsite. Evidence indicated they had been killed by the same bear, likely after accidentally encountering it while hiking off trail. The incident fundamentally changed wildlife management policies. DNA analysis of hair samples collected at the attack site confirmed the animal was indeed a grizzly bear, forcing wildlife authorities to acknowledge natural recolonization had occurred. Mandatory bear canisters were implemented for all backcountry camping, ranger patrols in remote areas were expanded, and warning signage was installed at all trailheads. For the surviving rescue team members, the psychological impact proved as lasting as Hollister's physical injuries. Sandoval eventually left emergency medicine to become a wildlife conservation educator. Jenkins incorporated her experience into wilderness safety courses she developed for outdoor leadership programs. Wellington continued search and rescue work, but campaigned tirelessly for enhanced communication systems and weapon authorizations for rescue teams in predator territories. Later, the attack was extensively documented in a bestseller film called Return of the Silvertip, bringing attention to grizzly recolonization throughout the Rocky Mountain corridor. Despite ongoing debates about predator management, most biologists celebrated the bear's return as a sign of ecological recovery, while acknowledging the complex challenges of human-wildlife coexistence in increasingly shared landscapes. The incident became a case study in wildlife management courses nationwide, examining how human wilderness activity intersects with natural predator recovery. For Colorado residents, the confirmation of grizzly's return transformed their relationship with wild spaces, adding both ecological significance and sobering reality to the understanding that wilderness remained truly wild, even in places where civilization seemed to have tamed the landscape. Heart of Norway's forest, the wilderness stretched untouched for miles, a vast expanse of dense pine forests, deep valleys, and rugged mountains. It was the summer of 2008, a season when daylight stretched endlessly and the land teemed with life. Ingrid Halverson, a 56-year-old seasoned hiker, had set out with a group of friends for a week-long trek through the remote terrain. The park, known for its stunning beauty and thriving wildlife, had seen an increase in bear activity over the years. Though brown bears were typically shy and avoided humans, encounters were not unheard of. Ingrid and her companions were experienced hikers who had traversed the Scandinavian wilderness many times before. They had been warned by park officials about recent bear sightings, but felt confident in their knowledge of bear safety. They carried bear spray, made sure to store food properly, and avoided hiking at dawn and dusk when bears were most active. Their journey had been smooth so far, the long daylight hours allowing them to cover great distances without worry. They moved through birch forests and open meadows, the air crisp with the scent of pine and moss. The occasional sound of a distant waterfall or the call of a ptarmigan punctuated the stillness. By the fifth evening, they set up camp in a secluded valley near a glacial river, the towering cliffs providing a stunning backdrop. As the sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they prepared dinner. Ingrid, feeling at peace in the solitude of nature, had always believed that the wilderness offered a sense of freedom unlike any other. She had spent decades exploring Norway's backcountry, always respecting the land and its creatures. But that night, a mistake was made. A small miscalculation, something she would have never allowed in the past. Someone had left food unsecured, a bag of dried meat, carelessly placed near the tents instead of being sealed away in a bear-proof container. The scent carried through the cool night air, an invisible invitation to the forest's most powerful resident. Somewhere in the dark, a bear caught wind of it. Ingrid awoke to the sound of rustling near the campsite, a low, deliberate movement rather than the random stirring of the wind. Her years in the wild had honed her instincts, and immediately she knew something was wrong. She sat up in her sleeping bag, heart pounding, listening carefully. Then came the heavy footfalls, the distinct sound of an animal moving with purpose. She unzipped her tent cautiously, peering out into the dim twilight. A massive brown bear stood just yards away, sniffing the ground, its powerful frame silhouetted against the pale glow of the midnight sun. Ingrid felt a chill crawl up her spine. The bear had found the food, and it was far too close. She knew what had to be done. Make herself known, back away slowly, avoid sudden movements. She whispered to wake her friends in the other tents, but before she could issue a proper warning, one of them, startled by the sight, let out a sharp gasp. It was enough to trigger the bear. The animal turned its massive head toward them, ears flattening as it took a step closer. Ingrid had seen bears in the wild before, but never at this proximity, never like this. It was assessing them now, weighing its options. She reached for the bear spray at her side, gripping it tightly as she stood her ground. The bear let out a deep huff, its breath visible in the cool air. Then, without warning, it charged. The world seemed to shrink in those few seconds. Ingrid barely had time to react. She raised the bear spray and aimed, pressing the trigger just as the bear closed the distance. A powerful burst of the deterrent filled the air and the bear recoiled, shaking its massive head as it veered to the side. But it wasn't gone yet. It pawed at its face, growling in frustration, its claws raking the dirt as it prepared for another advance. Her companions were scrambling now, yelling and throwing whatever they could to intimidate the beast. A flashlight beam cut through the dusk, illuminating the bear's muscled form. It hesitated, blinking against the light, then finally turned and lumbered back into the forest, its massive form disappearing into the trees. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. But Ingrid did not rise. She lay motionless, her body torn and bloodied from the bear's initial attack. The others rushed to her side, their voices frantic, but she was slipping away. As dawn broke, they reached a ranger station, but it was too late. The rangers listened grimly as the survivors recounted the night's events. They weren't surprised. Bear encounters had been increasing due to improper food storage and a rising number of hikers venturing deeper into bear territory. Ingrid had spent her life respecting the wilderness, but in the end it was the wilderness that claimed her. A single mistake had sealed her fate. The bears would always be there, roaming the forests as they had for centuries, indifferent to human presence. It was their land first, after all, and Ingrid had come closer than she ever wanted to understanding what that truly meant. On May 7th, 2025, Tanya and Alexei, seasoned travelers with an adventurous spirit, had planned their trip to Siberia's remote wilderness months in advance. The $200,000 camper van they owned was their pride and joy, customized to perfection for life on the road. After enduring months of city noise, they parked beside a quiet river in the wild heart of Russia's Far East, eager to bask in the isolation and beauty of the land. Unbeknownst to them, the peaceful evening would soon be shattered by a force of nature far more powerful than their van's steel frame. A grizzly, massive and ravenous after a long hibernation, had been roaming the forest in search of food. The scent of the couple's meal drifted through the trees, drawing the animal closer without their awareness. Driven by instinct, the bear followed the trail and reached the van just as night began to settle over the wilderness. Tanya was rinsing the last of the dishes when a faint rustling in the underbrush caught her attention. It was subtle but unnerving, enough to still her movements. A silent glance passed between her and Alexei, an unspoken acknowledgement that something was wrong. The sound intensified, culminating in the sudden crack of splintering wood. The van jolted violently and Tanya's heart skipped a beat. As she turned toward the noise, the grizzly's enormous face emerged through the bushes, its eyes locked on the vehicle with feral intent. Alexei reacted swiftly, reaching for the axe they kept by the door, but the bear was already upon them. With terrifying speed and strength, it crashed into the side of the van. Metal groaned under its weight as claws tore through the thick exterior, shredding the door like paper. Tanya's breath caught as she stumbled backward in shock. Alexei tried to pull her further away, but the bear closed the distance with horrifying speed. Before either could think to run, the grizzly's massive paw struck Alexei, sending him sprawling. Tanya lurched forward, reaching for the bear spray, but the beast was already on them. Alexei's agonized cry pierced the night as the bear's jaws clamped onto his shoulder, dragging him down. Tanya, gripped by a surge of terror, grabbed at him in a desperate attempt to free him. Blood spilled onto the earth, dark and fast. The bear wasn't finished. Tanya made a frantic dash into the trees, but the animal was relentless. One powerful swipe sent her crashing to the ground. Her legs were pinned beneath her, pain radiating through her limbs as the bear roared overhead. In that final moment, her eyes met Alexei's, his expression frozen in horror as life left his body. The bear turned its attention back to her, its gaze burning with hunger. She clawed at the ground, dragging herself away, but the bear struck again. Its claws raked across her chest, the agony blinding. Each movement felt like fire searing through her veins. She tried to fight to survive, but the grizzly's brute force overwhelmed her. Her hand searched blindly for the bear spray, her last hope, but she never reached it. With one final brutal swipe, the beast silenced her, its claws tearing into her throat. Nearby, a hiker, exhausted from the day's trek, heard the sounds of the attack. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The screams of the couple echoed through the night, followed by the horrifying growls of the grizzly. Paralyzed by fear, he dared not approach, fully aware of the danger that lay ahead. From a distance, he watched in helpless horror as the bear continued to maul the van, its claws tearing through the wreckage and rummaging through what remained of their belongings. By the time the bear finished its assault, it was well past midnight. The couple's bodies lay motionless, their lives claimed by the very wilderness they had come to explore. Still ravenous, the bear wandered from the van to scavenge the last of their supplies. At one point, it turned back, casting a final, fleeting glance at the destruction it had wrought. Authorities were eventually alerted. After tracking the animal to its den, they made the decision to euthanize it, a move deemed necessary to prevent further attacks. The tragedy sparked widespread discussion about the increasing risks of human encroachment into bear habitats. Some blamed the couple for a lack of caution, while others pointed to the broader issue of human presence disrupting the natural balance, placing both wildlife and travelers in harm's way. The hiker, still shaken by the events he had witnessed, later provided a detailed statement to the authorities. His account painted a vivid and harrowing picture of the attack. The deaths of Tanya and Alexei soon became a turning point in the ongoing debate about wilderness safety. Their story served as a grim reminder of how swiftly nature could strike back when its boundaries were crossed. The Siberian wilderness, for all its beauty and serenity, remained a place where danger lingered in the shadows, waiting for the unwary to stumble into its grip. In the remote wilderness of Russia's Amur Oblast, Alexei was known for his love of wildlife. A seasoned enthusiast, he had raised Boris, a grizzly bear, since he was a cub. Over the years, Alexei believed he had tamed the beast. Boris had grown huge, towering nearly 10 feet on his hind legs. Yet Alexei was convinced of their bond, trusting the bear to roam freely around his property. The community admired Alexei's courage, but few understood the risks of keeping such a dangerous creature as a pet. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alexei invited friends to his cabin for a gathering. The sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the forest. Laughter echoed as the group enjoyed the warmth of the fire. Boris wandered the property, his large frame moving like a shadow among the trees. Alexei beamed with pride, often saying there was no wild animal as gentle as Boris. As the evening wore on, laughter grew louder, but so did the silence that followed. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and suddenly the bear's behavior shifted. Boris's head snapped toward the gathering, nostrils flaring. The guests didn't notice the change, but Alexei did. His heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. The bear's eyes widened. Alexei, usually calm, stood up slowly, his mind racing. The bear's ears flattened, and a growl rumbled deep in its throat. Before anyone could react, Boris charged. Alexei was knocked to the ground, gasping for breath. The guests screamed, trying to intervene, but their cries were lost in the frenzy. Boris was a force of nature, his paws like hammers, each swipe carrying the weight of his fury. The bear's claws tore into Alexei's flesh, shredding his clothing and skin. The sound of ripping fabric filled the air. Alexei tried to scramble away, but his limbs felt heavy. The bear's jaws snapped shut around his shoulder, dragging him across the ground. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the bear's crushing weight. Panic spread through the group. One man rushed forward with a fire poker, but Boris barely noticed. With a swipe of his paw, the poker flew from the man's hand and he stumbled backward, terror-stricken. Another guest reached for bear spray, but it was too late. Boris's grip on Alexei tightened, and the bear's growl deepened as it mauled him. The guests' attempts to stop the attack were futile. Alexei, now half-conscious, was dragged to the edge of the clearing, his body limp. Blood stained the earth beneath him. For what felt like an eternity, the group watched in horror as Boris tore into Alexei, each movement deliberate and savage. The bear's teeth sank deeper into Alexei's chest, and his struggles grew weaker. The sight of Alexei's terror-stricken face was forever burned into their minds. His wide eyes seemed to plead for help, but no one could reach him in time. Finally, Boris released his grip, stepping back, its chest heaving as it surveyed the damage. Alexei's body lay motionless on the forest floor, blood pooling around him. The group stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Boris, after a final look, turned and lumbered back into the trees, vanishing into the wilderness. The silence that followed was deafening. The friends trembled, struggling to grasp the reality of what they had witnessed. They had all known Alexei kept a grizzly, but none imagined it could end like this. Boris had never shown aggression before. The bond between them had always seemed unbreakable. But now, Alexei was gone, devoured by the very animal he had raised and loved. The authorities were notified shortly after, but their response was cold. They arrived at the cabin where the group tried to explain. The police noted the bear's presence and made a quick assessment. They did not immediately declare it an attack by a wild animal, nor did they dismiss it as a freak occurrence. It was under investigation. They said they would need to capture the bear for examination, but as days passed, no sign of Boris was found. Some locals whispered that the bear had gone wild, while others suspected something darker, that the bear had broken from the bond it had shared with Alexei. In the wake of the tragedy, the small community was left shaken. The friends who witnessed the horror were never the same. They spoke little of the event, and when they did, their words were heavy with grief. Boris was never found, and the investigation was quietly shelved. The authorities chalked up the incident to a rare accident, a freak attack by a bear that had grown too wild. No one in the community dared to speak too loudly about the possibility that it had been something more. Alexei's death left an indelible mark on the community. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of keeping wild animals as pets. Those who once marveled at Alexei's connection with Boris now whispered in fear about taming such creatures. Yet despite the tragedy, some still believed that with the right bond, even the fiercest beasts could be tamed. As years passed, the story of Alexei and Boris lingered, a chilling reminder that sometimes the line between wild and tame is thinner than anyone realizes. In the dense, sprawling forests of Amur Oblast, Officer Sergei Baranov walked the trails alone, his boots crunching softly over the forest floor. The area had become notorious for bear sightings, particularly Russian grizzlies, which were growing more aggressive as their natural food sources dwindled. The Amur region was vast and remote, with miles of wilderness separating tiny villages and towns. It was his job to patrol these trails and ensure the safety of the few brave souls who ventured into the heart of this unforgiving land. Sergei had been a seasoned officer for over a decade. He had seen his fair share of dangerous situations, drug busts, car chases, and even animal encounters, but he had never faced anything quite like this. It was a late afternoon in early spring. Sergei had been walking the trail for hours, his radio crackling softly with updates from his partner Dmitry, who was stationed at a check-in point several miles away. Sergei paused for a moment, wiped sweat from his brow, and looked around. The forest was eerily quiet. Then, from the corner of his eye, Sergei caught a glimpse of movement, too large for any human. He tensed, his instincts kicking in. His hand instinctively reached for his firearm, though he knew he wouldn't be able to use it in time if it came to that. The sight of the massive bear emerged from the underbrush with terrifying speed. The grizzly, its fur matted and dull from winter hibernation, was easily twice Sergei's size. The bear didn't pause. Its black eyes locked onto Sergei, and it charged without hesitation, as though it had been stalking him for hours. Sergei's heart pounded in his chest. His instincts told him to run, but he knew that was futile. Bears were faster than humans, and their claws could tear through flesh with a single swipe. With the bear barreling toward him, he had only one choice: fight. His hand went to the radio, but there was no time. Sergei's training took over, and he took a quick step to the side, narrowly avoiding the first swipe of the bear's claws. The grizzly's momentum carried it forward, but Sergei's heart raced as he saw his opening. He fired a shot into the air, hoping to startle the bear, but the sound only seemed to provoke it further. Its eyes narrowed, and it turned to face him again, angrier than before. The bear lunged, this time with more ferocity. Sergei was too slow to dodge, and the beast's claws caught his side. Blood seeped from the deep gashes in his torso, and the bear's massive paw pressed down on his chest, pinning him to the earth. He struggled, gasping for breath, but the bear's weight was overwhelming. In those desperate moments, Sergei thought of his family, his wife, and his young daughter, and how he might never see them again. He fought harder, his hands scrabbling at the dirt, trying to push the bear off him, but it was no use. The creature's strength was unimaginable, and each time Sergei struggled, the bear pushed harder. A distant voice on the radio crackled again. Dmitry. Sergei barely registered it, his mind fogged with pain and fear. He couldn't respond. He had no strength left. Just as Sergei thought he might lose consciousness, the bear suddenly stopped, growling low in its throat. It stepped back for a moment as if weighing its next move. Sergei, panting and bloodied, could barely lift his head. His entire body ached, and his chest felt like it was on fire from the deep, ragged gashes the bear had left. He knew he had moments before the bear would finish what it had started. That was when Dmitri arrived. The sound of footsteps crashing through the forest grew louder, and Sergei felt a surge of hope. Dmitri had been too far behind to hear the radio call, but he must have realized something was wrong. Sergei heard the quick, rhythmic sound of Dmitri's boots hitting the ground, and then he saw him, his partner, rifle in hand, rushing toward the scene. The bear, startled by the new sound, turned toward Dmitri, its growls echoing through the trees. Sergei, his vision blurry, could barely keep his eyes open. Dmitri raised the rifle, but before he could get off a shot, the bear charged again, moving with frightening speed. Dmitri fired several rounds in rapid succession, the gunshots ringing through the forest, each shot echoing like thunder. The bear hesitated, then recoiled as if the shots had finally made an impact. Dmitri fired again, this time landing a shot that struck the bear in the shoulder. It growled in agony and backed off, its eyes narrowing as it limped into the underbrush, disappearing into the shadows. Sergei lay still, gasping for air. His side burned with every breath, the weight of the bear's attack still pressing on his mind. Dmitri reached him quickly, dropping to his knees beside his partner. The urgency in Dmitri's eyes was clear, but there was little he could do alone. With trembling hands, Dmitri applied pressure to the wound, but it was too late to stop the bleeding. They needed help, and they needed it fast. Dmitri radioed for backup, his voice tight with fear, as Sergei's world began to fade around him. The rescue team arrived just in time, but the damage had been done. Sergei had lost too much blood, and despite the best efforts of the medics, the officer succumbed to his injuries before reaching the hospital. Dmitri, devastated by the loss of his friend, stayed with him until the very end, his own hands stained with the blood of his partner. Julia was an experienced horseback rider, known for her skill and confidence in the rugged terrain of Wyoming's Teton Range. She had spent years navigating the mountains, training her horses to handle the steep, narrow trails that wound through the forests. On a crisp fall morning, she set out alone on a ride, eager to explore a less traveled path. Her horse, a steady mare named Bella, moved gracefully through the woods, the rhythm of her hooves a soothing sound on the soft ground. The trail hugged the edge of a steep ravine, with trees growing thicker, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked much sunlight. Julia enjoyed the solitude, but today, the stillness felt different. The wind had stilled, and the air felt thick with tension as though the world was holding its breath. Julia pressed forward, keeping Bella at a steady pace. Then a rustling sound to her right made her pause. Bella's ears pricked up and the horse let out a soft snort. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She had been riding in these woods long enough to know that sounds like that could mean trouble. She looked around, but the dense brush obscured her view. There was something there, something big. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but it was too late. A grizzly bear emerged from the underbrush, its enormous frame startlingly close. The bear's eyes locked onto Julia, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. Julia froze, her body tensing in preparation for what she knew was coming. Without warning, the grizzly lunged. Bella, startled by the sudden appearance of the bear, bolted, throwing Julia off balance. She felt herself fly from the saddle, her hands reaching for something to grab onto, but there was nothing. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of her lungs. For a brief moment, she lay there, dazed and disoriented, struggling to process what had just happened. The bear, undeterred, continued its charge. Julia scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She could hear the bear's paws pounding the earth, and she knew she had mere seconds to act. Panic surged through her, but she fought to stay calm. She had faced dangerous situations before, but nothing like this. She reached for the bear spray at her side, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the canister. The bear was nearly on top of her now, its teeth bared in a snarl. With one final, desperate movement, Julia aimed the spray and released the mist. The cloud of bear repellent shot forward, hitting the grizzly square in the face. The bear staggered back, momentarily stunned by the blast. It roared in frustration, shaking its head violently as it tried to clear its eyes. Julia's heart pounded as she took a few steps back, her legs still shaky from the fall. Bella, now some distance away, stood frozen, trembling in fear. For a brief moment, it seemed like the danger had passed. The bear, still disoriented from the spray, hesitated. Julia knew she had bought herself precious seconds, but she didn't have time to relax. She was already on her feet, ready to flee if the bear decided to attack again. The grizzly snorted, pawing at the ground as it slowly backed away, its eyes fixed on Julia. The moments stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Julia's hand hovered over her belt, ready to grab her weapon if the bear made another move. But the bear did not charge again. Instead, it gave a final snarl before turning and lumbering back into the brush. Julia stood there, her heart still racing, watching the bear disappear into the trees. She didn't move for several long seconds, afraid that any sudden motion might provoke it again. Her legs were weak, her breath shallow, but she couldn't let herself collapse. Not yet. Not while she was still in danger. Slowly, she approached Bella, who was still trembling but standing quietly at the edge of the clearing. Julia reached out, her hand gently grazing the horse's neck. Bella whinnied softly, a sound of relief. Julia took a deep breath, steadying herself as she mounted the horse once again, her hands shaking as she gripped the reins. She had survived, but only just. The bear had been too close. Her hands, still trembling, gripped the reins with newfound urgency. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. With a final glance around, Julia urged Bella into motion. The horse moved forward slowly at first, cautious, but Julia nudged her into a faster pace. She needed to get out of this part of the forest, away from the threat. As they rode back down the trail, Julia's mind raced, replaying the moments of the attack over and over. She couldn't believe how close it had come to being much worse. The bear had charged with a speed and ferocity she hadn't anticipated, and though she had managed to ward it off with the bear spray, the danger had felt all too real. She was lucky, luckier than many who had faced such creatures in the wild. The rest of the ride was tense. Every rustle in the trees made Julia's heart race, but the bear did not return. As she made her way back to the trailhead, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude and a lingering sense of unease. She had survived, but she knew better than most how quickly the wild could turn against you. She would never forget the power of that bear, or how close she had come to becoming another statistic in the wilderness. Later, Julia would share her story with others, urging them to take bear safety seriously. It wasn't just about having the right tools. It was about understanding the risks, respecting the animals, and never underestimating the wild. Her experience would serve as a stark reminder. Even the most experienced riders could find themselves face to face with danger in the heart of the wilderness. And when that moment came, the stakes could not have been higher. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan had always been a special place for Tyler. At 16, he had already spent a significant portion of his life camping, hiking, and exploring the vast wilderness that stretched across the peninsula. His family often took weekend trips to get away from the bustle of daily life. On this particular trip, Tyler was with a group of friends, all eager for a weekend of camping by a remote lake. It was early summer, the kind of time when the woods were alive with the sounds of birds and insects, and the air was fresh and vibrant with the promise of adventure. The group had set up camp in a quiet, secluded spot near the edge of a small lake. The surrounding woods were dense, a mix of tall pines and thick underbrush that seemed to stretch on forever. Tyler enjoyed the solitude. With his friends around, it wasn't quite as quiet as he would have liked, but it was still peaceful. They had spent the afternoon fishing and swimming, their laughter echoing across the water as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the camp. That night, after a meal around the campfire, the group settled down to relax. Tyler, however, felt restless. Something in the air felt different, heavier somehow. He stood up from the campfire and stretched, feeling the cool evening breeze against his skin. He told his friends he was going for a walk, and without waiting for a response, he wandered off into the woods. It was a familiar path, a place he'd walked many times before, but tonight, something felt off. He didn't know why, but the woods felt unusually silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The moon was only partially visible through the canopy of trees, casting patches of silver light on the ground. Tyler made his way through the underbrush, moving further away from camp. The sounds of the fire crackling and his friends' voices faded behind him. He didn't really think much about the fact that he had strayed so far from the group. He was used to the feeling of being alone in the woods. The peace of it, the stillness, was something he cherished. But then, there was a sound, something subtle at first, a rustling in the undergrowth. Tyler froze. He was used to animals in the woods, deer, raccoons, maybe the occasional fox. But this sound was different. It wasn't the gentle shuffle of small creatures foraging. It was too heavy, too deliberate. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the snap of a twig underfoot. His pulse quickened. Tyler took a cautious step back, his senses sharpening. He strained to listen, but there was nothing. The rustling had stopped. His mind raced. He told himself it was probably just a deer, maybe even a bear, but it didn't sound like a bear. He shook off the unease creeping up his spine and turned to head back to camp. That's when he heard a low growl, coming from just beyond the trees, a deep rumbling sound that sent a shiver of terror through his body. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as his eyes scanned the shadows. He didn't need to see the bear to know what it was. The low growl, the primal warning. It was a sound that any woodsman knew too well. His heart raced. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to make himself as small as possible, his back pressed against a tree. He hoped the bear wouldn't notice him, that it would just pass by. But then, the bushes ahead of him rustled violently, and the unmistakable shape of a black bear emerged from the shadows. Tyler froze, barely able to breathe. The bear, large and dark, appeared more like a shadow than a living creature as it lumbered toward him, its massive paws thudding heavily on the ground. It wasn't particularly close, but it was moving in his direction, clearly aware of his presence. The bear's head swiveled, its nose twitching as it scented the air. Tyler knew he couldn't stay hidden. The bear had already detected him, and it was moving toward him, not with the curiosity of an animal that had simply stumbled upon a human, but with the focused intent of a predator. Fear surged through him, but Tyler's legs wouldn't move. He tried to recall everything he had learned about bear encounters, all the advice he had heard on his previous trips. Stay calm, don't run, don't make eye contact. But none of it seemed to matter now. Suddenly, the bear lunged. It was too fast, too powerful. Tyler barely had time to react as the bear's massive claws raked across his legs, sending a shock of pain through his body. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the bear's growl as it knocked him to the ground. The force of the attack sent him sprawling into the underbrush, and before he could regain his bearings, the bear was on top of him, its weight pinning him down. The bear's jaws snapped, catching Tyler's arm as he desperately tried to push the beast away. Its teeth sank into his flesh with a sickening crunch, and Tyler gasped in pain, his body instinctively jerking away, but the bear's grip was unrelenting. His vision blurred as he struggled, the pain overwhelming him with each movement. Tyler tried to scream again, but the sound was muffled as the bear's paw swiped across his chest, knocking the breath from his lungs. His body felt like it was on fire. He knew he had to get away, but everything felt so heavy, so impossible. The bear growled, its breath hot and foul against his skin. In a flash of instinct, Tyler reached for his knife, the small survival blade tucked in his belt. His fingers brushed the handle, and with a surge of adrenaline, he gripped it tightly, bringing the blade up as best as he could. He drove it into the bear's side, feeling the resistance of its thick fur and muscle. But the bear seemed only momentarily distracted. It didn't retreat. Desperation clawed at him. In a final frantic move, Tyler managed to bring his knee up into the bear's chest. It staggered back, momentarily thrown off balance, giving Tyler just enough space to scramble to his feet. Blood dripped from his wounds, and the world around him was a blur of pain and terror. The bear didn't follow. Tyler stumbled backward, his breath ragged and shallow. He didn't look back as he ran. The woods blurred around him, his legs moving on instinct alone, the ache in his body forgotten in the wake of pure survival. It wasn't until he burst back into camp, where his friends were frantically searching for him, that he collapsed into their arms, the sound of his own cries echoing in the night.